I have been living in this wooden house deep in the heart of Maine for almost 3 decades, ever since I fully retired. The house is modest, with weathered walls, a roof faded by time, and a woodpile by the door that's always stocked. I used to be a doctor, quite a good one if my patients are to be believed. But that feels like a lifetime ago. Now my hands tremble and my eyesight fails me, though I like to think my mind remains sharp. Sometimes I wonder why fate decided I should outlive so many of my loved ones and patients. Perhaps it was so I could carry memories of things I dare not share, lest I be thought mad. I am over 80 now, and it has been exactly 6 decades since I encountered a story that still chills my spine on sleepless nights. They say time heals all wounds, but I feel no relief. Instead, I carry a thorn deep in my soul that refuses to let me rest. On certain evenings, when the wind whistles past the walls and it seems as though distant howls echo through the night, I startle and clutch my chest. In those moments, the memory of what I saw in a small, nearly abandoned settlement comes rushing back. The residents of that place were afflicted by a mysterious illness, and I was called to help. How they found me and why they turned to me specifically remains tied to a story that once connected me deeply to a man I considered a friend, though I haven't heard from him in many years. I received the letter when I was in my early 20s. I had just graduated from medical school and begun my practice in a small town somewhere in the eastern United States. Life seemed simple and straightforward. Wake up, go to the clinic, help patients, and return home to my wife, may she rest in peace, and our young son. But one cold January morning, I found a letter in my mailbox that changed everything. The sender's name was almost illegible, worn away by time and travel. But when I finally deciphered it, my heart sank. It was from Joseph Blackthorne, a man I hadn't seen in years, but who had once come perilously close to dying before my very eyes. I had saved his life, pulled him back from the brink, but after that, our paths diverged, and we never crossed paths again. The letter was brief but unsettling. Joseph wrote that he was in a remote settlement whose name meant nothing to me. He begged me to come as quickly as possible. He spoke of a strange illness afflicting the locals, of fevers and nightmares, of despair and fear that things could end very badly. The letter's rushed handwriting carried an urgency that was hard to ignore, with phrases like, "Only you can figure this out. I trust no one else. Forgive me for asking this of you." His words were oddly specific. How could Joseph be so certain that I would understand the nature of the illness? At the time, I attributed it to our past bond and his trust in me as a doctor. 2 emotions warred within me: fear of the unknown and a sense of professional pride. As a doctor, I knew I had a duty to help anyone in need, but something about the letter frightened me. It came from an isolated corner of the United States, a place neither I nor any of my colleagues had ever heard of. How could there even be civilization out there, I wondered, and how do they survive without regular medical care? But most troubling of all was the absolute urgency in Joseph's plea. He even wrote, "Forgive me for the lack of details. There are things here too dangerous to put on paper." I remember how long I hesitated. It was winter, and travel in those days was nothing like it is now. Narrow, snow-covered roads, rickety wooden bridges, trains that didn't reach everywhere, and mountains that were nearly impossible to access. My family was also less than thrilled. My wife cried and begged me to stay, especially since I had just been offered a position at a reputable hospital where I could advance quickly. And then there was my young son. Leaving him, even for a few days, felt like agony. But every time I considered refusing, an image of Joseph would come to mind. the man whose heart I had once restarted with my own hands in a makeshift field hospital. I couldn't turn my back on his plea. After a few days of inner turmoil, I made my decision. I packed the essentials into my medical bag: morphine, quinine, alcohol, bandages. I added a set of tools, an old stethoscope, syringes, glass ampoules. Then I included warm clothes, high boots, and a sturdy coat. The day I left was bitterly cold. The sky was clear, but the air was so frigid that my breath formed clouds instantly. I bid farewell to my wife and son, promising to return as soon as possible. The journey was long and exhausting. First, I boarded a train heading north, its wheels clattering over old tracks. The ride lasted all night, and by morning, a full-blown blizzard had enveloped us, making the warmth of the train feel like the only haven in the world. At the station where I arrived, a spring carriage, a rickety old buggy pulled by 2 horses, was waiting for me. The driver, apparently hired at Joseph's request, was a middle-aged man with a warm scarf covering half his face. He silently helped with my luggage and introduced himself briefly. "You can call me Ben." He spoke little, but his cautious gaze suggested that he wasn't just guiding me, but also concealing where we were headed. The ride in the buggy took several more hours. We traveled along snow-covered country roads that wound through barren trees. Gradually, the path narrowed, and the snow grew deep enough to reach the horses' knees in places. I felt the cold seep under my coat despite all my layers. Ben occasionally glanced at me with sympathy, but offered no comfort. There was nothing to be done but endure the merciless weather, clenching my teeth and hoping we'd soon arrive. At one point, I noticed the forest around us becoming denser and darker. The tree branches intertwined, forming a kind of tunnel through which we crept, listening to the crunch of snow beneath the horses' hooves. I thought to myself, if something goes wrong here, we'll have no choice but to spend the night in this wilderness. The only reassuring factor was that Ben seemed to know the way. Finally, after a few more hours, we stopped at a small roadside cabin where we swapped the buggy for something resembling a truck, an old battered vehicle adapted for these rugged conditions. The horses were exhausted, as were we, so I was relieved to move into a less exposed, if not much warmer, form of transport. The passenger door didn't shut properly, but at least I was no longer sitting out in the open. We continued on, winding through narrow paths that felt more like deer trails. Hills covered in pine trees surrounded us, and here and there rocky outcrops jutted out, resembling frozen creatures. It felt as though nature itself resisted our intrusion into this land. As we approached the final stretch of the journey, the truck could go no farther. The road had become too narrow and frozen. I had no choice but to continue on foot. With a sigh, Ben grabbed a lantern and walked beside me, carrying part of my luggage. "Not much farther now, Doctor," he said, and we trudged on, carving a path through the snow. I heard the faint whispers of the wind and occasionally the crunch of branches underfoot. At times I thought I saw shapes flitting in the shadows of the forest, but perhaps it was only the lantern light playing tricks on my eyes. Each minute dragged on like an hour, and just as I began to doubt we'd reach anywhere at all, the first buildings appeared through the trees. The settlement was small, no more than a dozen or 2 houses scattered unevenly along the forest's edge. In the twilight, they looked like frozen ghosts waiting in silence. Some windows glowed with warm yellow light, and smoke curled from chimneys. A strange mix of relief and unease washed over me. I had finally arrived, but what awaited me in this isolated place? Hearing our footsteps, a few people emerged onto the porches of their homes. They were bundled in warm clothing. One had a blanket wrapped around them, while another held a poker as if it were a weapon. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and apprehension. However, when they saw me, a clear outsider carrying what looked like a medical bag, they exchanged glances, and I caught a flicker of hope in their eyes. "The doctor is here," a soft voice called out, and the news seemed to ripple through the settlement. More residents stepped out of their homes. A woman in her 40s offered me hot tea from a thermos, and an older man helped carry my bag of medical supplies. Their warm reception surprised me. In remote places like this, strangers are usually met with suspicion, yet here I was greeted with gratitude and even relief. Eventually, I was led to a house near the center of the settlement. It was the largest one, 2 stories tall, with a wide porch and a sturdy door adorned with an iron handle. I realized this must be the home of the community's leader. In small settlements, the most important affairs are often centered there. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s greeted me at the door. He had a determined look and graying temples. He wore a simple but clean shirt and a warm sheepskin cloak. His handshake was firm as he introduced himself as Marshall Douglas. His voice was calm but resolute, carrying the authority of someone his people trusted. "Thank you for coming, Doctor," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "We were told you were on your way." "I apologize for the inconvenience. Our settlement is far from civilization and we rarely have visitors. But I'm glad you're here. People began falling ill a couple of weeks ago, and things are getting worse." He gestured for me to come inside. The spacious living room smelled of warm bread and burning logs. A few people were already seated there, some holding mugs of herbal tea, others looking pale and worn out. Marshall offered me a chair and, once I was seated, continued to explain. "It's a strange illness," he said. "It starts with mild itching, then weakness, fever, some have bad dreams, wake up screaming, and there are others with almost no symptoms, but they speak of unexplained anxiety. We don't know what this is, which is why we sent for you. No one knows how to treat it." I listened intently, nodding, mentally compiling a list of potential causes. New infections, fungi, parasites, the possibilities were endless. But without examinations, it was all speculation. It was clear that Marshall was deeply concerned for his people. His hands fidgeted with a crumpled note, likely a list of the sick or their symptoms. I made a mental note of his demeanor. He's trying to appear composed, but inside he's consumed by fear. Knowing how epidemics work, I understood that if this illness was contagious, time was critical, especially in a remote, snowbound place like this, far from any modern hospital. "I'm ready to begin examinations," I said at last. "We'd be most grateful, Doctor," Marshall replied. "Any help you can offer is invaluable." Thus began my first encounter with the settlement, a place I was about to delve into far deeper than I could have imagined. And yet, throughout it all, one question lingered in my mind. Where is Joseph Blackthorne, and why didn't he meet me himself? The next morning, I woke up early. The night had been restless. Outside, the wind howled, and inside, my thoughts churned with unease. I still hadn't seen Joseph, and no one had mentioned him. It was as if he had vanished into this snowy wilderness, leaving behind only his letter. The villagers knew a doctor was coming, but none seemed aware of who had summoned me. It was as though Joseph had dissolved into the cold, white expanse. I packed my medical bag and stepped outside. The weather had shifted. The wind had calmed, and the snow had stopped. But the bitter cold remained, each breath burning my throat. Marshall, the settlement's leader, was already waiting for me nearby. "Doctor," he said, "I'll take you to the first patients. We've set up a small cabin as a makeshift infirmary. for those who can no longer move around on their own. We walked along a narrow lane flanked by low wooden houses. The silence was broken only by the crunch of our footsteps in the snow and the occasional crackle of smoke from chimneys. Villagers nodded respectfully as we passed, some with hope in their eyes, others with fear. The infirmary was a small, single-room building with a solitary stove in the corner. Inside, several patients lay on makeshift cots, mostly elderly people and teenagers. I moved from one to the next, checking pulses, examining throats and eyes, and asking routine questions. When did the itching start? Do you feel joint pain? How are you sleeping? What do you eat? Their answers were strikingly similar. The itching had started around the same time for everyone, disrupting sleep and bringing strange, vivid dreams. Most of them reported weakness and occasional fever, but none of the cases appeared life-threatening. It all seemed like a mild infection or an allergic reaction, yet the sheer number of cases in such a small village alarmed me. I took temperatures. Some were slightly elevated, others near normal. The rashes, which sometimes turned into blisters, didn't match any dermatological patterns I recognized. They ranged from pale pink to nearly colorless, appearing in random places on each patient. I jotted down my observations, trying to make sense of it all. Could it be the water supply? Perhaps they were drinking contaminated water from a nearby stream. Or maybe their food, stored for long periods in cellars, had been tainted with mold or fungi. But for now, these were just hypotheses. When I returned to Marshall's house, I found about 20 villagers waiting, each with complaints. Some brought children with fevers. Most reported the same symptoms: itching, fatigue, nightmares, and low-grade fevers. I distributed ointments I'd brought along and made an herbal tincture to ease anxiety and help with sleep. The villagers accepted the remedies gratefully, their relief palpable. Yet I could see the weight of their expectations. They wanted to believe a doctor's arrival would solve everything, but I had no guarantees to offer, not yet understanding the root of their ailment. When the stream of patients subsided, I was left alone with Marshall in his living room. He looked at me, awaiting some kind of verdict. I sighed. "This resembles something viral or parasitic," I said. "But typically, with an outbreak of this scale, symptoms would be more severe. For now, I don't see anything critical, but the scale of the illness is concerning." Marshall nodded, his face grim. "What do we do, doctor?" I suggested implementing basic hygiene measures, boiling drinking water, airing out homes frequently, and monitoring the sick closely. I also resolved to continue examining patients to gather more information. The rest of the day was spent visiting homes. In one, I met a middle-aged man plagued by recurring nightmares, visions of animal faces, shadowy forests, and glowing eyes in the darkness. He had no fever, and his skin showed only faint redness on his wrists. In another home, I spoke with an elderly woman whose small scratch refused to heal. She insisted the wound had appeared spontaneously in the night. Listening to these accounts, I began to suspect the illness might not be purely physical but psychological as well. Could stress be the culprit? But how could an entire settlement simultaneously fall into such a state of distress? By evening, I returned to Marshall with a proposal. We should create a survey for the villagers to document their diets, work routines, and any contact with wild animals. I hoped to find a pattern. However, collecting such information here would be challenging. Many villagers were illiterate, and those who could write were hesitant. Still, we agreed to try the following day. Before bed, I asked again about Joseph, trying to piece together where he might have gone. "We don't have a permanent resident by that name," Marshall replied. "We do get travelers passing through, though. Maybe he's already left." The comment struck me as odd. Could Joseph really have left without waiting for me? Or was he hiding? Or perhaps the villagers weren't telling me everything. I decided not to press further, focusing instead on unraveling the mystery of the strange illness. That night I slept in a room on the second floor of Marshall's house. The lamp flickered and the floorboards creaked in the corner. I struggled with insomnia, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed of distorted faces, their hands morphing into claws and glowing eyes peering from the darkness. I woke drenched in cold sweat, my thoughts scattered. Perhaps I'm absorbing the villagers' fear, I thought. But the next morning, as I stared at the dark circles under my eyes in the mirror, I felt an unsettling realization creeping in. I, too, was beginning to catch their anxiety. I spent the entire first half of the next day examining the area around the settlement. The idea was simple. If there was reason to suspect that the source of the disease was hidden in the water, soil, or flora, we needed to check the nearby forests, river, if there was one, or lake. I was accompanied by a young man named Tommy. He volunteered to help after I mentioned that I needed a guide. Tommy looked healthier than the others, probably because he had almost no symptoms except for occasional nightmares. "Honestly, I'm scared too," he admitted, "but sitting idle is even scarier." We followed a narrow trail that led to the lake, about which I had learned from Marshall. There were still deep snowdrifts all around, and the sunlight reflecting off the whiteness of the snow was dazzling. The forest opened up on the sides, and soon we reached a clearing with a view of the frozen water surface. Heavy pine trees leaned over the shore like giant guards. I took some sample jars from my bag and asked Tommy to help break the ice to collect a water sample. After rummaging through my tools, I found a small axe, and soon we managed to carve out a hole. The water was surprisingly clear and odorless. I carefully filled several glass tubes and sealed them with tight rubber stoppers. I planned to later check for any sediment or impurities. Then we walked around the lake's perimeter and didn't notice anything suspicious. No dead fish, no driftwood, no signs of chemical discharge, which one might expect living closer to a town. In these parts, nature seemed untouched. I wrote a few notes in my notebook, noting that the lake was likely not the source of the trouble, but still left a reminder for myself. Check in more detail if possible. We continued along the forest edge. I examined the trees for fungal growths or strange mosses that could indicate some anomalous processes in the ecosystem. But aside from the usual lichens, nothing eerie was found. Tommy mentioned that in autumn there were many berries and mushrooms here. The residents were satisfied with the harvest, and no one complained about food poisoning. I noted again. If it's a parasite, it might come from animal meat, not plants. But in conversation, Tommy didn't seem to mention any mass hunting. As we walked, I kept feeling like I sensed someone's presence in the distance. It was as if shadows were sliding between the trees, but every time I turned my head, there was only a branch swaying in the wind. When I told Tommy about this, he whispered, "A lot of people here have that feeling right now, like someone is watching from behind the trees." We both fell silent, feeling uneasy. Suddenly, the crack of a branch echoed from deep within the forest, and we froze alertly. A man emerged from behind the trees, whom I first recognized as a hunter. He carried a rifle on his shoulder. Tall, bearded, in sturdy, warm clothes. Seeing us, the stranger slightly lowered his weapon and said, "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I went out for small game." Tommy immediately sighed with relief and smiled at the hunter, calling him Mr. Flynn. I introduced myself and said that I was a doctor who had come to their settlement to help with the disease. The hunter didn't look too surprised. "Heard we have a doctor now," he said. "My wife was complaining of itching. I told her it was nothing. It would pass on its own, but I'm not so sure about that now." I noticed that his own hands, especially his palms, had some red spots. "Yeah, this crap appeared on me too," Flynn admitted. "I don't even know where it came from, but it's damn itchy." I asked him to show his palms. There were small blisters, like from nettles, but paler. When I suggested applying ointment, he waved his hand, saying he was used to such minor things. However, the slight worry in his eyes revealed that he wasn't completely indifferent to the symptoms. I inquired about the hunter's diet, what he ate, whether he had encountered any wild animals that were sick or injured. Flynn frowned, as if remembering something unpleasant. "How could I not encounter, Doctor? We all live in the forest here. Last month we managed to shoot a strange beast. No one really understood what kind of creature it was. It looked like a wolf, but not a wolf, like a badger, but larger. Its fur was coarse, black-gray. I didn't want to shoot it myself, but the beast charged first, barely fought it off." Flynn shrugged, trying to show that there was nothing special about it, but I detected a note of concern in his voice. "We ate that beast later. It was just a local holiday, a festival. We roasted it over the fire. No one got sick then, and the meat tasted normal. Could this have been the cause?" My heart tightened. An unidentified beast, consumed by the entire village, significantly increased the risk of infection transmission. "How long ago did this happen?" I asked. "At the beginning of winter, Doctor, about a month and a half ago," Flynn replied. The puzzle was starting to come together. The timeline could indeed coincide with the onset of the first symptoms. I suspected that the beast could have had parasites or viruses unknown to medicine. After thanking Flynn, Tommy and I talked with him a bit more about hunting, but didn't uncover anything supernatural. The hunter shook my hand in farewell and went back into the forest, waving his rifle at us. I pondered, perhaps this wild beast is the key to the mystery. What if it was something like a mutated wolf, a carrier of a rare disease, or worse, an entirely unknown creature? Returning to the settlement, I immediately went to Marshall to share my suspicions. He confirmed that yes, they had a festival where they ate an unusual beast they nicknamed Black Fur. Some residents said the meat tasted good, slightly sweet. But back then, no one even thought about the potential danger. I asked to find out if they still had any remains of the bones or hides to take samples for analysis. Marshall shrugged. "Maybe some remains are left. We need to ask people. Although some of the remains were thrown somewhere in the forest." Thus, I first directly encountered the thought that this disease could be related to eating something improper, alien to human nature. And because of that, it seemed even more dangerous. For if it was a mutated parasite, who knows what forms it could take? In the evening, as I tried to sleep, fragments of images appeared before my eyes again. The yawning mouth of the beast, bloody meat on skewers, the hunter looking into the black eyes of an unknown predator. Perhaps this would be the key to the mystery, although I didn't even want to imagine what such a discovery could lead to. The next morning, I asked Marshall to introduce me to the person who was the main organizer of the festival where that very meat was served. It turned out to be a man named Harry Winston, a local enthusiast who organized a winter celebration for the entire village every year. Axe-throwing competitions, songs, and dances around the bonfire. The festival always lifted people's spirits before the harsh frosts, Marshall explained. But this time, in addition to the usual food, there was this strange trophy brought by Hunter Flynn. I met Harry at his home. He was a short man around 45 with friendly wrinkles around his eyes, but a look that conveyed worry. He invited me to sit by the fireplace, and as we settled in, he began to talk about the festival without hiding his bitterness. "We always celebrated the beginning of winter and the end of the hunting season," he said. "But this time Flynn brought game that no one could identify. The hide was black, the fur was coarse, and the beast's eyes were cloudy, but that was after death. Some said it could have been a wolf or a coyote hybrid. But the meat tasted good, though unusual. We decided, since he had already shot the beast, why throw it away, so we cooked it over the fire." I asked, "Were there any alarming signs with the beast during the butchering? Maybe a strange smell or the color of the flesh?" Harry thought for a moment. "I remember that when we were skinning it, the beast seemed bony, but its muscles were well defined, like those of a strong predator. The blood was thick and almost black, but we thought it was because of the cold. We didn't notice any unusual smell. Honestly, we were all in high spirits back then. Songs, dancing, someone had already drunk some hot punch. Maybe if it weren't for that atmosphere, I might have noticed the oddities. But gradually I learned new details. It turned out that almost all the residents tasted the meat, except for some women and children, those who preferred other flavors or, for example, had already eaten enough of the other treats. Interestingly, almost everyone who is sick today confirmed that they ate that game, while those who didn't eat it either didn't get infected or have minimal symptoms. This detail fit neatly into a clear pattern. Something in that meat could have been a carrier of the infection or a parasite. I asked a direct question. "Is there anything left of that carcass? Bones, head, hide? I need to take samples." Harry shrugged. After the festival, people took what they could and threw away the remains. Someone said that the most useless parts were taken deep into the forest so as not to attract wolves to the village. I heard that Hunter Flynn wanted to keep the hide as a trophy, but then seemed to give up because the fur was tough and smelled bad, and no one knew how to process it properly. Maybe he burned it. After talking with Harry, it became clear to me that the threads of my investigation led directly to the mysterious beast that no one in the village had seen before. I needed to somehow obtain samples, and if they weren't available, perhaps find traces at the location where Flynn shot the animal. "Ask Flynn for more details," Harry suggested. He said the beast lunged at him somewhere at the foot of the hills to the west. Maybe the bones of its companions are still there. This idea seemed a bit crazy to me. Could there still be similar beasts living there? But there was no choice. I had to check all options. I found Flynn in the evening. At first he objected. "Why do you need to go there? There's nothing to do there in winter. It's too cold and dangerous." But then, hearing my arguments about needing to save people, he agreed to take me to where he said he saw several animal skeletons. "There's a cave," he reported. "I think the beast lived nearby. But I didn't go in myself. I only saw the bones out of the corner of my eye." The thought of what kind of lair might be deep within the rocks made me shiver. But for the sake of a diagnosis, I was ready to risk a lot. Thus, I formed a hypothesis that the disease might have started from the contaminated meat, and was likely spreading through direct contact with carriers or their excretions. There were no laboratory confirmations yet, but I saw how the condition of some patients was worsening. They began to complain of severe headaches, nausea, and a few developed new, more serious symptoms: fever and seizures. Meanwhile, whispers about a curse started circulating among the villagers. People constantly asked me, "Doctor, can this really be cured? Are we not facing something terrible?" I tried to reassure them, but inside a bad feeling was growing. When evening came and I finally sat by the fireplace at Marshall's to warm up a bit, thoughts of Joseph resurfaced. Could it be that he knew everything in advance? Why was his letter so brief, without details? Where is he now? I had already decided that in the morning I would go to that cave with Flynn. Perhaps I would find clues that would help determine the nature of this terrible affliction. That night, I fell asleep uneasily, trying not to think about the increasing number of sick people and the fact that any day of delay could lead to a catastrophe. In the deep silence, I imagined someone wandering outside, quiet footsteps crunching through the snow, then fading away. But when I looked out the window, I saw only moonlight on the empty street. Maybe it was just my imagination, exhausted by fear and a sense of responsibility? Or was someone really watching me, waiting for me to take another step toward the solution? At dawn, Flynn and I set out. The weather had turned cold again, so much so that my cheeks and nose began to numb the moment I peeked out from under the blanket. I grabbed a flashlight, a few candles, and a small pouch with medical supplies, alcohol, bandages, a small scalpel, and sample tubes. Flynn armed himself with a rifle and a long hunting knife. He looked like someone who really didn't want to go to this place, but his duty to the village compelled him. I could feel the fear lurking in his soul about what we might discover there. The journey took no less than an hour. We left the settlement, turned onto a narrow path that first wound through the forest, and then began to climb higher up the rocky slope. The snow here wasn't as deep, but the incline made walking difficult. Feet slipped, and we had to rely on protruding roots and stones for support. Flynn kept stopping periodically, scanning the surrounding area as if expecting another mysterious beast to appear. I, on the other hand, tried to walk carefully to avoid falling, while also peering into the gloomy gray cliffs. Occasionally, pine cones crackled in the wind, and fallen cones lay scattered along the trail. Finally, we reached a small crevice in the rock, behind which a dark abyss opened up. Off to the side, something resembling a wide fissure became visible. It was the very cave we were looking for. "Doctor, it's better not to go too far," Flynn warned. "It might be slippery inside, and we don't know who or what lives there. I once saw a predatory lynx there, or maybe something worse." But I had no choice. If this cave indeed held the remains of similar beasts, I was obligated to collect bone samples. We entered, and I turned on the flashlight. The warm yellow light revealed stone walls covered with mold and some kind of streaks. The cave floor was uneven, strewn with stone rubble and dirty snow blown in by the wind. However, just a few steps from the entrance, it became noticeably warmer. The piercing wind barely reached us. Flynn moved forward with his rifle slung over his shoulder, and I followed, striving not to miss any details. In the depths, I could hear a soft dripping sound. Water seeping from the vaults, falling into puddles and creating a ghostly echo. After walking a couple dozen meters, we stumbled upon a pile of bones. My breath caught at the sight. Many had been gnawed by time and possibly other animals. But among the debris, skulls and large bones were clearly visible, some strangely deformed. I crouched down and shone the flashlight. One of the skulls resembled that of a wolf, but the jaw was disproportionately long, and the teeth seemed larger than those of ordinary wolves. I'd only seen such teeth in textbooks for large predators, and even then, not always. Another smaller skull could have belonged to a coyote or a fox, but it also looked abnormal. Fused bony growths, almost like spikes. Fur was scattered everywhere, already half decayed and soaked with moisture. The smell was heavy and putrid, though the cold winter air tried to mask it. I took out a clean cloth and carefully wrapped several bones, taking them as samples. I looked at Flynn. He was paling. "This is... Damn it, Doctor," the hunter cursed, staring at the remains. "I don't know what kind of creatures lived here, but definitely nothing good. Damn it, Doctor. And we ate one of these." His voice carried both disgust and fear. I could understand how horrifying it was to realize that at one point he had eaten the meat of a creature that might have been mutated or infected by something. It was truly terrifying. I noticed another pile of bones against the wall. There was a skull fragment, even more deformed, with protruding cheekbones and a torn frontal bone. Perhaps the animals fought each other, or maybe it was the result of some other circumstances. But the fact remained. Inside this cave was the lair of creatures that clearly differed from the familiar species of wild fauna. The twisted, irregular bone structures suggested diseases, mutations, or some hellish mix of both. While I was extracting a small scalpel to carefully separate bone fragments from the frozen ground, Flynn suddenly tensed and sharply raised his rifle. "Shh," he whispered. "I heard something." We both froze, hearing muffled sounds, like the rustling of footsteps in a distant corridor of the cave. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps someone was really wandering deeper inside. My heart stopped, and I felt fear creeping into my bones, just like the ice beneath our feet. "Let's get out of here, Doctor," Flynn whispered. I nodded, feeling that there was nothing more for us to do here. I had already taken the necessary samples. Delving further into the dark tunnels where a living monster might be hiding would have been reckless. Neither of us had enough equipment or people to feel safe. We quickly packed up our things and, trying not to make any noise, moved toward the exit. I carried the bundle of bones in my bag like a trophy earned at the cost of my own cold-bloodedness. The closer we got to the light at the entrance, the more relief I felt. The frosty air outside stung our faces, but it was better than the cold of the cave, permeated with the smell of death. "This is madness, Doctor," Flynn said when we moved to a safe distance. "What are we going to do now? You don't think there's an entire pack of these beasts around here, do you?" I tried to calm him, saying that we didn't know exactly how long those remains had been in the cave, and that it wasn't certain there were still living specimens there. But deep down, I was trembling at the thought that we might have only scratched the surface of a much larger problem. On the way back, Flynn kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting another creature to jump out from around the bend. I walked ahead, overwhelmed by mixed emotions: fear, disgust, and a certain grim determination. I needed to study these bones as soon as possible, even though it was almost impossible in the village conditions. But at least I could try to identify their species and assess whether there were any parasites or signs of disease on them. Upon returning, I discovered that even more people in the village had fallen ill, and those who were already sick had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Did anyone offer me help? Yes, but it wasn't enough. People were trying to hold on, but panic was in the air. It was then that I realized we absolutely needed to return to the cave to learn more. Without additional information, we would continue to wander in guesses, and the disease would keep claiming everyone who had tasted the suspicious meat. Perhaps the answers lay deep within the cave. The next day, I persuaded Flynn to accompany me again. He was initially reluctant, saying things like, "We've already seen the scariest things, and going further is like plunging into death." But my argument that without this, we were doomed convinced him otherwise. At dawn, we prepared our gear. Flashlights, some provisions, ropes, and a hunting rifle in case we encountered predators. My legs were shaking even before we set out. These cold, gloomy forests, the snowdrifts, and most importantly, the very thought of returning to the lair of inhuman creatures. But fear had to be overcome. We followed the same trail as last time. The forest seemed gloomier. Thick fog enveloped the tree trunks, and branches creaked in the cold wind. Flynn barely spoke. Only occasionally would he exchange glances with me, as if silently asking, "Maybe we should turn back." But I stubbornly pressed forward. After an hour, we reached the familiar black abyss, the entrance to the cave. Putting on gloves and checking our flashlights, we entered, and the cold, damp walls enveloped us, as if warning us. Inside it was quiet, except for the dripping of water from the ceiling. We carefully made our way across the slippery floor, illuminating our path. I wanted to delve into the deeper passages that we hadn't managed to explore last time. That's where the key might lie. Perhaps the nests of these creatures, remnants of other slain beasts or even people. Suddenly, around one of the turns, we encountered a narrow fissure in the rock through which we barely squeezed, finding ourselves in a spacious grotto with a stone ledge on the edge. Below, a deep pit yawned. "Look, Doctor," Flynn whispered, pointing his flashlight downward. "If anything's wrong, I didn't notice it before. It seems you can only descend here with a rope." We exchanged anxious glances. I was about to suggest going down when I heard a dull thud from below. These sounds were definitely not like animal growls, more like rustling mixed with soft knocks, as if someone was desperately trying to climb up. My heart tightened. Who could be there? I wanted to shout, "Hey, are you alive?" But I was afraid of attracting the attention of a possible enemy. Suddenly, muffled words came from below. "Is anyone there? Help? I hear voices up here?" I exchanged a frightened look with Flynn, but curiosity and hope prevailed, and I shouted, "We're here! Who are you?" A response didn't come immediately. There was a rustling below, then a dim flashlight beam appeared. I took a step back, ready to run if something horrible emerged from the darkness. But from the half-light emerged a person, a thin, emaciated man with scratched hands. He looked like a villager, only dirty and exhausted. His face seemed strangely familiar, but I couldn't recall where I'd seen him. Flynn exclaimed with relief in his voice, "John, we thought you were missing, buddy. Damn it! How did you end up here?" I squinted involuntarily, trying to figure out why I had the feeling that I knew this person. Through the grime and overgrown stubble, familiar features emerged. He looked up, and in the flashlight's light, our eyes met. His eyes widened, and a flash of recognition crossed his face. "Doctor," he breathed out. "Could it be you're really here?" I blinked, and suddenly something clicked inside me. Standing before me was Joseph Blackthorne, the very person whose letter had pulled me into this wilderness, but whom I had unsuccessfully searched for since my arrival. I couldn't understand why he was being called John until he spoke, interrupting our silence. "Forgive me, Doctor. I didn't want the locals to know my real name. In the village, I introduced myself as John," he said, breathing heavily. "But when I realized the trouble here, I sent you a letter, hoping you'd reach in time to help." Flynn gave me a puzzled look. He clearly didn't understand anything. "So you're not John? So you're the same Joseph? Then why lie?" "I'll explain everything later," Joseph replied, his voice trembling. "Right now, the main thing is to get out. I came down here a few days ago. I wanted to scout out what was hiding in these tunnels. I took provisions and a flashlight with me, but the maze of passages turned out to be enormous. I got lost and almost died of hunger. Luckily, I had enough supplies for a few days, and these creatures wandered deeper. I heard their howls, saw their shadows. They're terrifying, Doctor. I can swear they're not ordinary animals. I helped him climb up, seating him on a flat stone. Flynn gave him some water, and I began to examine his wounds. Fortunately, they were shallow. While I was bandaging him, Joseph explained that after arriving here, a few days before my arrival, he tried to determine the source of the disease and suspected that the beast from the cave was just the tip of the iceberg. He noticed strange writings or drawings on the walls, and the labyrinth, according to him, breathes something ancient and evil. I think something involved here is older than all of us, he whispered, looking at the dark abyss beneath our feet. I sighed and asked him what we should do now, but he didn't know the answer. Essentially, neither did I. We were facing something unknown, and no one knew how to combat the disease. There was nothing to do, and we decided to return. We escaped the cave, constantly looking back. It seemed like foreign eyes were watching us from the depths. Thus, we emerged into the biting wind, rejoicing in the daylight, no matter how dim it was. The journey took less time than usual, partly because we were in a hurry, as if we felt that something terrible could happen in the village. On the way, I managed to ask Joseph about the reasons that prompted him to hide his identity. So that Flynn wouldn't hear, he quietly said that he had problems with the authorities. He punched a guy in a bar, and that guy turned out to be the mayor's son. Then they decided to hang all the dogs on him, and he had no choice but to start hiding in this wilderness. Upon hearing this, I just nodded. I knew he was a good guy, so I didn't judge him. When we emerged from the thicket, we saw smoke in the distance. It was too much for ordinary chimneys. Thick black clouds were rising above the houses. My heart skipped a beat with anxiety. As if confirming my fears, muffled cries came from there. Flynn grabbed his rifle and Joseph clenched his fists. We quickened our pace. It seemed the village had descended into chaos. At several houses, doors were wide open. Bloody stains were visible on the snow here and there, and from afar, women's wails could be heard. I rushed toward the voice, and we found that someone from the locals was lying right at the doorstep of his house, barely breathing. "Doctor," moaned a woman, whom I recognized as Mrs. Walsh. He collapsed. Fever, fire inside. I knelt down before her husband, Mr. Walsh. He was delirious. His eyes shone feverishly. His pulse was irregular, his skin burned. I asked Joseph to bring water, but he quickly looked around. There was no water nearby except for a pitiful bucket with remnants. We poured the remaining water into his mouth, at least so he wouldn't die from dehydration. At that moment, another scream came from somewhere on the right. "Doctor, come quickly!" I glanced at Joseph. "Help them, I'm coming!" and rushed toward the screams. In one of the alleys, I saw a young boy convulsing, held by two relatives by the hands. The boy had foam at his mouth, shouting incoherent words. "Soon? Everything is over?" I tried to administer a sedative from my small first aid kit. After the injection, the convulsions began to subside, but I understood that this was only temporary relief. Soon we realized that in the few hours we were away, the disease had made a huge leap forward. Half of the residents were complaining of severe weakness and fever. Some were on the verge of madness. The infirmary we had set up 2 days ago was overcrowded. My assistant, Dolores, she hadn't eaten that meat and remained healthy. And I tried to care for the most severe cases, but it was almost hopeless. Moreover, the supply of medications was rapidly dwindling. I noted that Joseph had stepped into the role of my assistant, helping to carry water, bandaging wounds, giving advice, and soothing patients. As I was attending to new patients, I was piecing together the facts in my mind. The disease hadn't intensified so quickly for no reason. Perhaps a climax was approaching, when the bodies of the infected would move into the next stage. I had suspected something like this before, but now I felt that it could turn into a real catastrophe. At Marshall's suggestion, we began relocating the most aggressive, those who were already delirious and attacking people, to an old barn. This was done both to prevent them from injuring themselves and others, and to isolate the source of the infection if necessary. An atmosphere of panic reigned throughout the village. Some were crying, begging me to find a cure. Others huddled in groups, whispering about a curse. Some, more religious, were calling upon God for help, while others had lost all hope. Isolating the sick remained our only tool for containment. But I saw. The disease had already infiltrated everyone who had ever touched that wild flesh. That evening, when we were exhausted sitting on a bench at the infirmary, Joseph suddenly quietly said, "Doctor, I forgot to say." As I was walking through the underground tunnels, I saw cave paintings depicting some sort of half-beasts. Maybe these aren't new creatures, but ancient evil, as I thought. I'm afraid it's awakened now. We're playing with fire. I closed my eyes, shuddering at the thought that we were likely facing not just a virus or a parasite, but something that goes beyond conventional medicine. The night began with a cold wind and a clear sky. When the moon appeared above the treetops, it illuminated the village with a ghostly light, sending an unpleasant shiver through my soul. I remembered that tonight was a full moon. Usually people paid little attention to it, but after everything I had witnessed, I felt uneasy. It was as if nature itself was hinting that something dreadful would unfold tonight. Joseph and I stayed to guard the infirmary where the relatively calm patients were lying. In the old barn, we had already locked up about a dozen residents who were exhibiting aggression and delirium. A couple of strong local guys stood watch there to ensure that no one escaped. At one point closer to midnight, I noticed that several of the sick were experiencing intensified convulsions and an unusual gleam in their eyes. Their temperatures had risen so high that touching them was terrifying, as if they were burning embers. They stopped responding to questions, breathing in gasps and emitting prolonged sounds more akin to wheezing. I felt sweat trickle down my temples. Something was happening, and these changes were decidedly not in our favor. "Doctor," whispered Dolores, my assistant and healer, touching my hand. "I'm scared. They're acting like they don't recognize us. Look at them." I approached a woman named Mrs. Scott. She looked up at me with dilated pupils, her lips slightly parted, emitting a soft moan. When I tried to speak to her, she suddenly grabbed my hand with a ferocious strength and hissed something incoherent. I barely tore her fingers from my sleeve, realizing that an ordinary woman couldn't possess such a grip. My pulse quickened and I recoiled, sensing something was terribly wrong. At that very moment, screams erupted outside. I glanced through the infirmary window and saw a man running out of a neighboring house, followed by a figure staggering and baring its teeth, a creature resembling a wolf on its hind legs but with human proportions. I dropped my flashlight in horror. These signs were familiar from tales of werewolves, but what I was witnessing now seemed worse than any legend. A creature with a contorted face, covered in patches of fur, was gasping for air convulsively and growling. The man panicked and fled, but the beast leapt after him. A wild screech echoed through the air. I grabbed Dolores by the hand. "Run to the barn immediately, check what's there, I'll join you soon." Dolores nodded, trembling with fear. She dashed out. At the doorstep, she collided with Joseph, who was returning from a neighboring house. He had seen everything and exclaimed, "Lord, it's begun." We merely exchanged glances, understanding that we were powerless against this phenomenon. In the infirmary, where the weaker patients were lying, something terrible began to unfold as well. A couple of patients who couldn't stand up earlier now seemed infused with wild strength. I heard bones cracking. One, right before my eyes, started contorting, twisting into an unnatural pose. I saw his fingers elongate, nails turning into claws. His eyes filled with red, and he let out a painful howl that made my hair stand on end. With each passing second, this creature lost its human appearance. Patches of skin were covered with coarse fur. His neck stretched, and his jaw and nose fused together, forming something like a beast's snout. "No, no," I muttered, backing away toward the door. I tried to recall any medical knowledge that could explain such a metamorphosis, but found nothing reasonable. It was beyond the bounds of conventional understanding. I pressed my back against the wall, trying not to be seen, but he still noticed me. The newly transformed creature turned its head, and in the dim light, its eyes glowed with an amber, malicious gleam. I felt someone clutch my shoulder desperately. Turning around, I saw Flynn. He had been with us from the very beginning, helping with the evacuation, clutching his rifle tightly just a minute ago. But now his face was pale, eyes clouded, breathing raggedly. He was whispering something indistinct, as if struggling against an invisible force. "Doctor, something is happening," he croaked, and suddenly his legs gave out. "Flynn!" I shouted, rushing to him, but immediately recoiled. His body was already beginning to change. He writhed on the floor, pressing his hands to his chest, guttural growls escaping his throat. I watched as his fingers lengthened, nails turning into sharp claws. Flynn's face twisted, his jawbones snapping forward and stretching. His skin was dotted with patches of dark fur. It was a monstrous sight and all too familiar after what I had already seen. In an instant, he arched his back as if trying to resist the transformation one last time, then collapsed to the floor. When he raised his head, my partner was no longer there. His amber eyes gleamed with wild malice, his jaws with protruding fangs clamped shut with a dull click. The newly formed beast lifted its head and let out a prolonged howl that made my legs feel like they were glued to the floor. The creature that had once been Flynn stood on its paws, ears pinned back in menace. Its gaze darted toward me. I froze, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. At the same time, another creature's growl echoed from the infirmary corner. I was caught between two monsters, ready to tear me apart. I was fortunate that at that moment, Joseph burst into the infirmary, wielding a long stick. He distracted the creature by shouting, "Hey, monster, come here!" The wolfman lunged at him, and Joseph deftly dodged, trying to maintain distance. I realized we were in mortal danger, but we had to escape. Somehow, we shoved him together, knocking over a cabinet filled with medicines. The beast howled, and we took advantage of the distraction to jump outside. There was true hell outside. Judging by the screams, similar transformations had begun in different parts of the village. I noticed dark silhouettes prowling between houses, heard chilling howls. Ordinary people who had begged for help half a day ago had now turned into wild creatures capable of tearing anyone's throat. Perhaps not everyone had fully transformed, but those exposed to the moonlight clearly carried the beast gene. The frost stung me even more than the cold air. These creatures were not just wolves. They resembled that mysterious beast from which it all began, distorted larger, with bony growths. Amidst the chaos, Joseph and I spotted Tommy running toward us with a bewildered face. He was holding a rifle, but his eyes were filled with panic. "Doctor, they broke down the barn door from inside, killed 2 guys trying to hold them back. They're no longer human." I looked around, my heart aching with pain. So many I had tried to save were now roaming the streets, having lost their human form and consciousness. Cries and growls mingled as people panicked, some calling out for their loved ones, only to hear the beast's snarls in response. Hiding in houses was useless. The creatures easily broke down doors. "We need to leave," I whispered, feeling nausea rise in my throat. "You're suggesting we abandon everyone?" Tommy exploded. I only gave him a bitter look. "What do you suggest? If we stay, they'll tear us apart. Gather everyone who's still healthy." Desperately, we darted through the village, picking up the remaining healthy, my assistant Dolores, another man. Some couldn't move a muscle out of fear. Others ran on their own. Everywhere there was a crackling sound, animal screams and humans' dying cries. The moon hung above us like a cold witness to this massacre. I was on the brink of madness, but knew we wouldn't survive here. Thus began our terrifying exodus from what I once considered a quiet and peaceful settlement. Our escape began under the flickering moonlight, which seemed to illuminate all our fears. We, a handful of survivors, me, Joseph, Tommy, my assistant Dolores, and another man. The other healthy ones had either fled in panic or been killed by the creatures. Just minutes separated us from encountering another werewolf, of which there were plenty prowling the village. We ran out into the snowy street, trying to stay close to the walls of the houses. Screams and howls behind us reminded us of the complete chaos that had engulfed the settlement. Somewhere doors and shutters were breaking, walls shaking from blows. It seemed the monsters were searching for the remaining people to tear them apart. I tried not to think about those who might still be wandering the homes in search of salvation, ordinary women, children. But a voice echoed in my head. "I am a doctor. I can't leave." And at the same time, another thought. "Stay. You'll die, and no one can help." I barely held back tears when a woman with a child ran past us, screaming in terror. A moment later, a creature jumped out from the side, and their screams were cut off. We couldn't help, no matter how hard we tried. "This way," whispered Joseph, pointing to a side alley. We moved toward it, crouching down. I heard one of our own breathing heavily, gasping from cold and fear. Dolores injured her leg. She tripped and fell onto a rock. Joseph supported her by the arm, and I kept looking around, trying not to lose sight of the dark silhouettes. One of the creatures flashed at the end of the alley, sensing us. I saw its snarling face in the moonlight, and uneven growths along its spine. My heart sank. Another second, and it would leap. But Tommy fortunately shot. The monster howled, apparently wounded in the side, but not dead. It just backed around the corner, growling. Our group managed to turn the other way before it recovered. We ran between the houses like frightened deer. Finally, we reached the outskirts of the village, where the forest began behind the last houses. The pursuit was relentless. At one point, when we were almost out onto the trail, the man walking with us panicked and sprinted straight through a wasteland. I wanted to shout at him to come back, but it was too late. A creature jumped out from the darkness, knocking him to the ground. A terrifying screech pierced our ears. Joseph grabbed my sleeve. "Run, or we all die!" It was hard to realize that the only chance was to leave the unfortunate one behind. But a harsh truth echoed in my head. It was either us or death. So we, gritting our teeth, hid under the cover of the dark forest. Branches and snow crunched underfoot, and somewhere behind us, screams could still be heard. I thought I saw eyes peering from the tree branches, but maybe it was just my imagination fueled by events. We didn't know if the monsters had a sense of smell like wolves, whether they could find us by our tracks, but there was no other way. "What next, Doctor?" whispered Dolores, clutching her injured leg. "We can't keep running forever." "We need to get to the trail," I replied, looking back at Joseph and Tommy. "From there, try to reach the nearest town. Warn the authorities, the military, anyone." Tommy sighed heavily. "I doubt anyone will believe us, and the road isn't nearby." "We have no other choice," Joseph spoke. "I saw them in the caves, and now you see what they've done to people. If we don't stop it, they could spread beyond the forest." And although we understood that we might face death from hunger, cold, or the monster's claws, we still moved forward. With each minute, walking became harder. Deep snow, wounds, and adrenaline burning our last strength. In several places we heard faint growls and creaks behind the trees, so we moved as quietly as possible. I remembered how, just a few days ago, I was walking peacefully on this trail, discussing the strange game with Flynn. Who would have thought that soon I would be running from a whole pack of anomalous werewolves? Almost an hour of wandering later, we reached a frozen stream where we took a break. I searched my bag for bandages, helped to wrap Dolores' scratch more securely. Everyone was silent. We could only guess if we were being pursued. We flinched at every sound, leaning on rifles and knives. However, no one appeared. Perhaps the creatures continued their slaughter in the village and the forest wasn't yet of interest to them, but we weren't going to stay to check it out. "There's an old trail here," Tommy finally spoke. "If we go northeast, we'll reach a hunting cabin. My friend kept it. Maybe there are supplies and fuel left there." We nodded in agreement. We had to move somewhere, and every minute of delay was dangerous. My heart was breaking as we left the village. But we were helpless against these monsters. If we could reach civilization and bring help, it was our only chance to help the survivors. And what if someone else was still hiding and waiting for rescue? So we moved further, trying to avoid open spaces. The forest rustled. The frost bit my cheeks. Along the way, we occasionally noticed untouched wild animal tracks, but to our relief, we didn't see any human tracks besides our own. Soon, the dark silhouettes of the trees around us thickened, and we realized we had delved into the thicket, a dense area, almost impassable in winter. And yet this path was better than the direct road, where the monsters could catch us. By the time the moon began to set towards the horizon, we were still trudging forward. Exhaustion became monstrous. Even my legs could barely hold, and Dolores had a throbbing wound. Finally, someone let out a joyful breath. Ahead, a dark structure loomed against the hillside. Approaching closer, we saw a creaky sign on the porch, the hunting cabin Tom was talking about. It was clear it hadn't been used for several seasons. Windows were dust-covered. The door was crooked. After checking that no one was inside, we cautiously entered. Inside, it smelled of old wood and mustiness, but it was at least some shelter. There were still logs in the fireplace. Tommy immediately started stoking them, and Joseph and I inspected the rooms. Hunger reminded me of itself. My stomach growled and my mouth was dry. Fortunately, in a dusty cabinet, we found a jar of pickled vegetables and some crackers. Better than nothing. The whole group settled around the barely warming fire. For a moment, we allowed ourselves the luxury to relax. Exhausted to the limit, we had secured this small island of safety in the middle of the night forest nightmare. It was hard to realize that just an hour ago we heard the last screams of those dying in the village. Now our goal was one: survive and warn others. And although we understood that unknown monsters could find us here too, we tried at least to give our bodies and weary souls a brief rest. No one knew what awaited us beyond the next dawn. 2 days later, we finally reached a small town on the edge of the state. And to say that no one believed us is an understatement. When we, exhausted, in clothes stained with blood and dirt, recounted what had happened, the local sheriff looked at us as if before him was a gang of alcoholics raving about monsters. But as soon as he saw our injured Dolores and the claw marks on Tommy's body, doubt flickered in his gaze. Fortunately, there was a small private clinic in town where we took Dolores. The local hospital doctor initially didn't understand what was happening, but seeing the torn wounds, admitted that they were definitely not from an ordinary beast. While Dolores and Tommy were recovering, Joseph, Flynn, and I sat all evening in the sheriff's office, recording the protocol. We told them everything: how the strange disease broke out in the village, how people gradually lost their human form, and then staged a massacre. The sheriff called in the nurse and the pharmacist one by one to examine our scars and confirm that the matter was serious. Maybe he didn't fully believe in werewolves, but he realized it was an extremely dangerous situation. Closer to night, 2 officers from a neighboring larger city arrived looking like military men and began interrogating us more harshly. I explained that our main goal was to return to the site with a team of armed men to check the village, help if anyone survived, and isolate the cave. Listening to this, the officers merely grimly nodded. One of them, introducing himself as Captain Hardy, asked me, "Are you sure this isn't just a rabies outbreak among wolves? People in panic could have mistaken dogs or wolves for werewolves." "Sir," Joseph intervened, "I saw human bones changing right before my eyes. This isn't rabies. Please, believe us, we're not insane." Captain Hardy remained silent for a long time, examining us with Joseph. Then, seemingly making a decision, he said, "All right, tomorrow morning we'll assemble a group of soldiers. A doctor will come with you to confirm your words on site, but I warn you, if it turns out to be a fabrication—" He didn't finish, but the tone made it clear. There would be consequences. It didn't scare me because we were telling the truth. The next day, near the town square, 2 military trucks were assembled. On one of them, I saw a doctor named Wilkins whom I had spoken to beforehand. He had specifically armed himself with a set of ampules, bandaging materials, and other medical supplies, preparing for the worst. We were offered to stay in town. Supposedly, you are already exhausted. But I refused. Without me, no one could show the exact path to the village and the cave. Tommy also volunteered, as he knew the forest, and Joseph insisted he had to go. Felt it was his duty to help stop this evil. The road took half a day. Captain Hardy noticed that the access roads to the village were almost impassable due to the snowfall. We had to leave the trucks and continue on foot in a column. The soldiers kept their weapons ready. Officers shouted commands. I felt a strange nervousness. Maybe we're going into a dead zone, or maybe not. When we approached the village, we were met with a truly gruesome sight, though different from the hell we saw running away. There was complete silence here. No rustling, no sounds of life. The houses stood empty, like cardboard models. Fallen fences around, dark stains on the walls in places. I ran my finger over one. Blood, dried and almost black. but no bodies. And no signs of huge paws or claws on the snow since enough precipitation had fallen to cover old tracks. It was as if everything had vanished without a trace. We entered the infirmary, where not long ago I was trying to treat the sick. The beds were empty, only some bloodstains and torn sheets here and there. In the corridor, bandages lay scattered. No signs of life. I heard one of the soldiers muttering under his breath, and another taking out a camera to document everything. Captain Hardy stared at me silently, surely suspecting that I had exaggerated. But I showed him the signs of disorder: blood, broken doors, shattered windows. This couldn't have happened by chance, I repeated, and he grudgingly agreed. Joseph decided to check the barn where we had isolated the aggressive ones. The scene was even scarier. Burnt logs, a collapsed roof, and inside, chaos, torn clothing, iron chains with which we had tried to bind some of the sick, all in blood, but no bodies. I saw Joseph flinch, clenching his fists. He realized none of us likely survived. Either they transformed into monsters and left, or someone took them away. Or perhaps something even worse. Then the military moved to the cave. I was taken into a small squad of 5 people, including an officer, Captain Hardy, and Dr. Wilkins. Tommy walked alongside, quietly holding a rifle. We reached the entrance to the cave, stumbling upon a hidden path covered with snow along the way. Inside, everything looked almost the same as during our previous visit. The same vaults, the same damp cold. Only where I had examined bones before, now there were only debris and scattered fragments. Someone had clearly been touching them, maybe taking them away. Dr. Wilkins tried to collect samples, but little remained. As we delved further, the officers noticed that the cave branched into several corridors. "We need specialists and good weapons here," someone in the soldiers muttered, inspecting the dark abysses. "We can't make do with just flashlights." We didn't encounter any creatures, no signs of life at all, just deafening silence and the echo of our footsteps. After about 2 hours, we surfaced, finding nothing but a few bones, reminders of the tragedy. Then Captain Hardy declared that the entire area needed to be cordoned off, and the state authorities would make decisions on further measures. I was ordered to return to the town and not share details with anyone. Joseph, although he wanted to stay for research, was also sent back under the pretext of confidentiality. As if by a snap of fingers, the government took control of the case. Soon some agents in dark suits appeared, hinting that this story was not to be disclosed, so as not to provoke panic. Our group had to sign non-disclosure papers. We saw the military setting up posts and barricades, then even telling the locals that this was a dangerous zone, an outbreak of an unknown epidemic. No admissions of monstrous werewolves. Everything was strictly closed. We were only told that we would be thanked for our cooperation and sent to different places. Doctors and surviving witnesses will receive medical help and rehabilitation. It sounded like a sentence. It was as if they were lulling us with assurances that everything would be fine. After those events, Joseph, Flynn, and I were sent to a safe place, the same town we had initially reached, and given rooms in a hotel. We were under the unspoken supervision of agents who didn't allow us to disclose details of what had happened. Dolores was being treated at the clinic, recovering. I visited her daily to make sure her condition was stable. No one asked about the epidemic. The town lived its own life, and only rare rumors about a quarantine in a remote area circulated among the locals. But no one suspected that there had been a massacre involving monsters. I noticed that Joseph was longing to tell the truth. He spoke with me, saying he would like to return to the caves to finish the job. But it was impossible. The authorities had taken control of everything, and blockades had been set up around the village. Naturally, we couldn't even get close. Tommy, having lost almost all his acquaintances in that village, was in deep sorrow. His life had turned upside down, his home disappeared, and everyone he knew had either died or disappeared without a trace. He spent days silently sitting by the window, watching the bustling human figures who had no idea of the evil lurking in the forests. When Dolores recovered and was discharged from the clinic, I tried to discuss further plans with her. Maybe we could move to another state, away from this nightmare. But she, like most survivors, remained in a suspended state. "I can't just leave everything," she repeated. But she was also afraid to break the military and agents' prohibitions, as if some invisible force kept us here. And we waited to see what would happen next. A week later, representatives of neither the Army nor the Special Service arrived. They conducted lengthy conversations, asked us to describe everything we saw, and made us sign non-disclosure documents again. I felt the real reason. They wanted to handle the anomaly on their own. In the end, one of them, a gruff middle-aged man, quietly said to me, "Thank you for your cooperation, Doctor. We'll take care of the situation from here. If you don't need any additional help, you can return to your former life. We will keep in touch with you." These words sounded frightening. We'll take care of it ourselves. It seemed that government structures were not just planning to treat the disease, but perhaps wanted to study the phenomenon or use it for their own purposes. I remembered the gaze of those creatures when they chased us and shuddered. Who knows what could come out of experiments with such evil? Before we could recover, rumors began to spread in the town. Authorities reported the elimination of the infection center. The situation is under control. No reason for panic. Clearly, they covered everything up. About the village, they said that residents have been evacuated. I doubted that anyone had survived there besides us, but no official information was provided. Finally, by spring, it became clear that there would be no official investigation with public reports. We were allowed to leave the town, advised to focus on life and health. Meanwhile, several soldiers directly told us, "You shouldn't return there. It's now a closed zone." Joseph shook my hand and suggested meeting in the future if we managed to conduct an independent investigation of what happened. I agreed, but felt a strange emptiness in my soul. They essentially ordered us to remain silent, and the entire village, all those unfortunate people, were swallowed by a deep secret. Since then, at the place where the cave was, there has been a military base, and even after 60 years, no one is allowed in, and only I, who survived those events, know what happened there.